Good morning. Welcome to the National Book Festival and welcome to the History and Biography stage. My name is Leanne Potter. I work at the Library of Congress and I am thrilled to be here this morning with Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Dunbar is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University and is the National Director of the Association of Black Women Historians. Her new book is entitled She Came to Slay: The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. If you'd like to see Erica's presentation that was pre-recorded for the book festival, you can log in to www.nationalbookfestival.com, go to the stages link, go to History and Biography, and on the left-hand side, just scroll down until you see Erica's name. Click on it and you can watch the whole presentation. But this morning, we are really fortunate because we have the opportunity here to hear directly from Erica herself. In just a minute, I'm going to glance over at the questions that are coming into us. But before I do, I want to read you something that I really enjoyed in my own digging about Erica's book. One reviewer describes her book as a lively, informative, and illustrated tribute to one of the most exceptional women in American history, Harriet Tubman, a heroine whose fearlessness and activism still resonates today. In Erica's book, she describes Harriet Tubman as brave, fearless, committed, and extraordinary. And I take all that to mean that the next 30 minutes or so are going to be pretty extraordinary as well. So Erica, thank you so much for being here on Saturday morning. And as we were saying earlier, I am confident some of your students from Rutgers are absolutely on the line because they too want to hear what you have to say. And I am... So thank you. And I've got to tell you, we've already got questions coming in, which is also really exciting to me because like you say, it's Saturday morning. But I'm going to go ahead and start with the very first one. Kathy wants to know, what was the most surprising thing you found out while writing this book?
Well,
that's a good one.
Great question, Kathy. And let me just start by saying thanks for having me and making this session available on this. I'm in Philadelphia, so it's this rainy kind of gray morning, and the fact that people can tune in their pajamas and enjoy, hopefully, this time, I think is important. So thank you so much for being here as the moderator and to have this this time with us. So the most interesting thing, or maybe surprising thing, I realized while working on this book was understanding the kind of scope of Tubman's life. We think we know Tubman, right? Because typically when we look at history textbooks in sort of K through 12, there's always that page or two where there's maybe a picture of Tubman and a picture of Frederick Douglass and, there's slavery. So we think we know her. We think we know, yeah, she's Underground Railroad. I think for me, what was so fascinating was to understand that was technically, over the scope of her life, a very kind of small window for her, that she spent a good number of years enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland, but over half a century living as a free woman. And so what I tried to do in the book, and what I would argue, I wanted to write it in a way that was accessible. There are a few really good kind of history texts about Tubman's life, and I'm thinking about writers like Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton, who've written kind of adult biographies. What I wanted to do was to write a book that would resonate for this moment meaning last year and this year, one that would ring true and connect to a younger generation of people starting to know Harriet, knowing Harriet in part through the biopic that came out last fall, And so the book was really created to bring these to bring a kind of fresh and a more modern understanding to who Tubman was as an enslaved woman, as a fugitive, and then living for half a century, more than half a century, as I said, as a free person.
I love that. I love that you've gone into some detail because as I'm listening and I'm glancing at the questions, they're feeding very nicely. So Steve is curious. He's got two questions, and I like the two together. He said he's wanting to know, how did Harriet herself escape from slavery, and who helped her, if anyone? And I think that question about who helped her is an interesting one. All right.
Yeah, no, I do think that I'm a writer and a historian and a professor, so I'm always going to tell you to read books, right? But I think that now that we have this kind of feature length film of about Harriet Tubman's life, that's the kind of quick version to get at. Not always 100% accurate; it's close, but what I will say is that her escape, Harriet Tubman's escape, was um, it's amazing. Every time I sort of think about um, the the tenacity and the grit required to do what she did, it always sort of kind of stops me in my tracks when I have those kind of momentary pangs of discontent. I'm like, okay, get it together, Erica. Like, you didn't walk 100 miles, like Tubman. So Tubman actually makes the decision to run off finally in 1849. And she does this in part because she knows that it's very possible, at least probable, that she was going to be sold. And not only herself, she was pretty sure that her two of her brothers would be sold as well. And what most people don't know, we don't see this in the biopic, but what most people don't know is that when Tubman um, takes off in the early fall of 1849, she actually doesn't go alone. She goes with two of her brothers. And they're attempting to make their way out of the eastern shore of Maryland. And at some point, her brothers make the decision that it's too much. It's they don't know where they are. No one's literate. They don't have the necessary equipment, and they make the decision to not bet on the unknown and to return to the farms of the eastern shore of Maryland, and to face whatever consequences were necessary. And Tubman tells us later on in her life that she didn't want to go back, but her brothers, they basically dragged her back. And so she went unwillingly, and really it was probably the last time that she let a man make a decision like that for her, or anyone make a decision like her. So she returns with her brothers, and then very quickly, within weeks, she makes the decision to run on her own. And so we have like the first kind of reward notice, runaway fugitive notice that we see in the early fall, October of 1849. And she makes that journey on her own. She never gives us the names of those men, women who helped her in Maryland, in Delaware, making her way up to Philadelphia. We know that she was involved and greeted by William Still, who was a very well-known conductor or station master on the Underground Railroad. But as most who were fugitives, they never gave away the names of the people who helped them, because to assist a fugitive, especially after 1850, that was a federal offense. So she had to protect those who helped her. But we know, I think I'm glad Steve asked this question, because sometimes we have this kind of mythic understanding that all the abolitionists who helped runaways were white men and women, and there were a good number of them. But it's super important to understand that there are free and enslaved Blacks who are helping in this journey to find freedom, in this attempt to escape. And we see that. And every time Tubman returns after 1849, we just sort of think about this host of people who were either perhaps convinced or maybe paid, or and also just sort of from their hearts and their minds knew that slavery was wrong and helped people escape. So this was something, this was like years of a cohort, a network of people that Tubman relied upon.
Yeah, I love that. I love the use of the word network. Okay, we're getting lots of good questions. So there is a question here from Diane is curious. Can you talk about her role in the Civil War and specifically the raid that she led or participated in?
I love that question, Diane, because and once again, we don't often understand or know about Tubman's role in the Civil War. And let me just take a moment to sort of paint a picture. Tubman had been going back and forth to Maryland and basically helping to emancipate her family and friends for close to a decade. We're talking about at least 13 trips back and forth, rescuing between 60 and 70 people, mostly friends and family. And then she, is spending time in the North. She actually has a home upstate in New York. And she's actually on the kind of abolitionist circuit. And she's going throughout New England, kind of telling her story in a very sort of careful way, because she's still a fugitive and there is a bounty on her head. And she is really approached by the governor of Massachusetts, who asks her to join in the Union cause, to go down to South Carolina. He knows her story, he knows what she's done, and he's basically said, "You are exactly what we need in terms of being a spy or a scout. You've proven your ability to hide in plain sight and to be helpful in liberating people. Will you join?" And she agrees, and she heads down to South Carolina, to the Sea Islands of South Carolina in 1862. And it's important to understand, at this moment, she is still enslaved. She's still a fugitive. So she
Mhm.
made this decision to head down to South Carolina. Well, the state of Maryland had not done away. They were a border state. Remember, they held on to slavery for a long time. We don't see emancipation until 1864 with them. So she, as a fugitive, goes deeper into the jaws of Southern slavery to participate. And she goes down with the intention of being a scout and a spy. And of course, because of her race and because of her gender, she's kind of forced into domestic um, uh, responsibilities. So she's serving as a cook. She's serving as a nurse. She's actually helping men and women who were recently liberated to find a way to take care of themselves in these contraband camps throughout South Carolina. She's teaching women how to bake pies and sell them to Union troops. And so eventually the time comes where she's sort of proven she's connected, and she becomes super connected with the community of enslaved and formerly enslaved people there. And she gathers her intelligence, and she finds out where the Confederates have placed basically torpedoes and bombs along the river. And it's because of this knowledge, because of her ability to connect with people, that she leads in 1863 the Combahee River Raid, which manages, there's this drunk history episode for that some of you may have seen, where it's funny, but it's almost sort of accurate in that she knows from her informants exactly where these torpedoes were placed and is able to navigate around these barges, these boats up the river for a surprise attack on the Confederates in that area. And so she's successful in that attack. But I think what's super important is in that attack alone, Tubman is able to emancipate almost over 700 enslaved people who had been kept kind of compressed and controlled by Confederates in South Carolina. So when we step back and we ask the question, how many people did Tubman actually help to liberate? In Maryland, that question is 60 or 70 people. But when we think about this raid and her involvement in the war, we're the numbers are pushing close to 1,000. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
that is amazing. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to try to do something creative with these questions. There are 3 questions that sort of piggyback on each other. So let's see. Mary is curious about your research process. Okay, so we're going to answer Mary's question about research. Steve says, in Maryland, we rarely hear of Tubman and Douglas as state native daughters and sons and American heroes, and yet they are. And he wants to know, why do you think that is? And then I think it's Shelley says, if you have a chance, fellow viewers, visit the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park here in Maryland. It's fabulous. So I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about your research? Speak to Steve's curiosity about why we don't celebrate, perhaps, and then kind of wrap up with, in your research, did you visit places, or was most of your research focused on collections and archival materials? Okay, how's that for a combo?
That's a good job. Good job. I wrote little notes to myself because I don't know that I can remember everything.
Yeah, I was going to say I've got it too.
without notes these days. So this book came together. I was really sort of commissioned to write this book. Now, I've taught Tubman for years. I've been teaching for over 20 years now, and she's always sort of a staple in my my work on enslaved women and slavery and freedom. And I've been thinking about her, but my editor, Don Davis, came to me and said, listen, I've been in conversations with some of the folks who are involved in the biopic on Harriet Tubman, and we think it would be a great moment to put out something about Tubman, but to do it in a way that so it would appear at the same time as the film, because we understood that the film, filmmakers have a hard job. They basically, to compress Tubman's life into 2 hours is like, that's a Herculean task. But there's going to be a lot that's left out, and so I was basically commissioned to write this book. To serve as the go-to after you've seen the movie, like, well, what else do I want to know about Tubman? So I admittedly, I had a kind of, historians work slow, like really slow. So when people tell you, oh, you have a quick deadline, then you feel like a journalist and you're out of your world. And so I really spent a good kind of 6 months doing additional research. And what I will say is that, there are, as I said before, there are a significant number, maybe 2 or 3, 4, maybe text secondary sources that are out there that have culled through the primary sources. One of the great things about the digital age, in addition to us being able to hang out today, is it allows me to access archives digitally, but it required me to get up and go, and that's what historians do as well. I had a shorter time period to do the research, but fortunately I had been reading and teaching Tubman, as I said, for decades. I think that on one of those trips I went down to Cambridge, Maryland. Annually they have a Harriet Tubman conference, and I went down to the conference and also spent some time at the state park, which is fantastic. I'm not certain that it's open right now, but if it isn't, you should definitely make an attempt to see it, because it's spectacular. What I will say is Tubman and Douglas were indeed kind of the daughter and son of Maryland. And not just that, they're contemporaries, right? Mm-hmm. So they're born around the same time. And that's, I think that's important to remember, that, but they have such different paths, right? So here are 2 fugitives, basically, one man, one woman, who make the decision. They both spent time on the eastern shore of Maryland, and they both extract themselves from from the jaws of slavery. What's so different is that Douglas is seen in a way that's very different from Tubman. In many ways, he becomes a superstar, right? And
Mhm.
like, he
Mhm.
writes this when he was asked to write about or contribute to Tubman's narrative, her autobiography penned by another person. And he basically says, you know, I came out of enslavement. I've been on the abolitionist circuit. I've written books. I'm well known. I receive applause and celebration. Whereas Harriet Tubman had a very different path. She was not literate, and she was on the ground of liberation. She was going back in and out of enslavement to free people, something that Douglas did not do. And that's not to diminish what he did do, but they worked
Mhm.
in very different circles. And for that reason, Tubman had to be kind of anonymous, right? She was, and
Mhm.
also her freedom was not purchased the way that Douglas's freedom was. She remained a fugitive until Maryland ended its laws about slavery, until the end of the war, really. And so she was someone who was in the shadows. She had to be. And also later on in life, she did not have the wealth that Douglas had. She didn't have the access. She lived a kind of difficult life, which was very different from Douglas. And that's important to think about, because as a woman, as someone who was um, unable to read and write for the large majority of her life. We think she was able to read. Not We're not certain about the writing part towards the end, but she was a constant behind the scenes warrior. I'd argue that she saw herself as and her role as doing God's work, and
Mhm.
that was something different from what we see with Douglas. She was a servant leader and hated to take credit for anything that she did. She always turned it over to her God as the reason for her success. And but what we also see with Tubman's life, she lived in poverty for the entirety of her life after freedom, in a way that was very different from Douglas. She wasn't meeting Abraham Lincoln and serving as an ambassador in the way that Douglas did. She was literally picking up trash in New York, upstate New York, to and feeding them and feeding her pigs and trying to live a kind of agrarian life. It was hard, but I like the last question, which is we should definitely see them as a son and daughter of Maryland and contemporaries who embody what the troubles and the triumphs were of that period of time in the 19th century.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I have to say, I love the way you talk about her. It's as though you know her. And I think that's really marvelous. I think that happens when you do really good research and you really dig into someone. It's just fun to listen to you. So a few of the questions that have come in have to do with how Harriet Tubman has been portrayed in film. And Anne is asking, in your video interview with Dr. Carla Hayden, the librarian, she said you were part of the recent movie that was made about Harriet Tubman. What part did you play in that film?
So, well, it's not quite and first of all, I had a ball with Dr. Hayden. It was a great conversation. If you haven't seen it, go tune it, figure out how you get there, because she's a wonderful communicator, and it was just a privilege to talk with her. So I didn't work on the film. I was in conversation with the executive producer, um, sort of in the towards the end of the filmmaking. So much of their research came from, I'd argue, Kate Clifford Larson, who's a scholar, was involved in some of that research. And there was really a desire, having these conversations with Deborah, the EP on the film, to think about how it was how it would be promoted. I also did a couple of conversations with Casey Lemons, the director, on NPR. So we were able to be in conversation with each other once the film came out. And I think that was really important because there were different opinions, feelings about the film. But what I love is A, that this film exists. B, it's like a long time for Harriet Tubman to get something like a biopic. And I also think that as a historian, I'm probably the worst person to go to the movies with, because I'm always like, that's not true, or that's not accurate, or they didn't have glass windows, or I'm that person. But I will say that with this film in particular, that they stuck pretty much to the skeleton of Tubman's life, that period of time that it focused on, and with some, a little bit of Hollywood exaggeration here or there for dramatic purposes. I'm thinking about her sort of reunion with her husband, John Tubman. That sort of didn't shake out the way it was on the film. But what I love about it is that it can draw anybody to read a book about Tubman, to think about the history of that period, that time period, and also to situate her as a revolutionary. Like, that is so important. And right now, I think we all need a little bit of some Tubman courage when we think about this moment that we're living through right now.
Yeah. There are quite a few additional questions related to your research process. And Desiree asks a question. So she says, for aspiring writers, can you talk about what your research process looks like? And that's very similar to what Libby is interested in about your research process. But then she adds, what are the tangible steps to finding the full picture of Tubman you wanted? How did you know? I love this because this is my question all the time. How did you know you had researched enough and could begin writing?
Oh, I don't think any historian ever feels like they've gotten enough. And I'll say that I think that's particularly difficult for those of us who write about enslaved people, about women, people who aren't in the archives the way that, say, a Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or whomever, who've written their diaries and their journals, and they're archived. And for those of us who focus on Black women in slavery, the archives are not kind to us. We have to spend a tremendous amount of time reading between the lines. And so that usually makes the research process super long. I mean, the book before Tubman took me 9 years to research and write, and it was about another fugitive, enslaved woman who was a fugitive. And so what I'll say is, you never feel like you're ready. You never want to lay down the quote research and then start writing. And people do it in different ways. I like to amass enough primary sources and secondary sources to feel like I can write with authority. But I'm never, I think that I would be a bad historian if I thought that the work was ever done. And I think that there will be historians and writers who come forward in the future who unearth, maybe there's a diary that falls out of somebody's desk when they're moving.
That kind of thing happens.
That can change a story, that can make a pivot. And so history is living. It's alive. It's not static. And so what I'm hoping is that this text is just another kind of accessible way for us to think about Tubman.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said what you did about something might just appear. As you know, a couple of years ago, the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian acquired jointly a photo album that included a photograph of Harriet Tubman that was not known to have existed. And I think you included in your book, the Howland photo.
It's a gorgeous photo.
Yeah. And so if folks who are on the line, if you're interested, you can just go to the library's website or to the Smithsonian website and find that photograph. Our time is just about up, but there is one contributor, JL, who has written a couple of questions. I want to make sure I get one of these in here. It's as interesting. One of the questions is, Did anyone ever find a genetic connection between the daughter that Harriet Tubman adopted and her?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's going to take us longer than a minute with what we have left.
This is where we say, get the book.
Well. Here's the thing. That's like a contested portion of Tubman's life, right? And one of the things that's great about Tubman is that she has so many living descendants, right? So many of whom are very involved and are out and writing pieces, appear in the New York Times recently. And so, that's a contested terrain. There's some who believe that her adopted daughter, Gertie, was connected to her, most biologically. Most do not, or some do not. And what I think is really important, though, when we think about Tubman and her daughter, is that she was adopted. Tubman did not have biological children of her own, and she, at a very difficult moment in time, the kind of nadir in race relations, in deep poverty, she was working to build her life, to create a life in freedom that included marrying a man, Nelson Davis. So Harriet Tubman Davis, if you look at her tombstone, it says Davis. Marrying and raising a family. And that's one of the other things that we don't think about with her courage, that after everything she went through and what was still in front of her, that she was determined to find her love, her piece of happiness and family in the world. And just like she did everything else, she made it happen.
I love it. What a nice note to wrap things up on. I do want you to know that some of the folks who've been asking the questions are now just saying thank you and telling you how excited they are now to get your book and to read it. And Jamila, I have to say this because I love this idea. She says, I just did the Harriet Tubman Byway self-guided road trip, and it was amazing. Yeah. It inspired me to buy your book and an adult biography. There was so much I didn't know. Thank you for your work. Anne as well says, thank you so much. I'm really excited to learn more. So everyone, I am sorry, but we really are out of time. Thank you, Erica, for generously sharing your time with us today. All of you, we have been speaking with Erica Armstrong Dunbar, whose latest book is She Came to Slay: The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman.